Okay, today we'll be talking about the cell theory. Our two essential questions for this unit are what is the cell theory and what are similar functions of all cells. We'll begin by defining a cell. A cell is the smallest structural and functional unit of an organism, which means it is the basic unit of life, and nothing on Earth that is considered a living organism can be smaller than a cell. Cells are so small, they're usually microscopic, which means they cannot be seen by the naked eye and you need a microscope to see them. All cells have similar functions and some similar structures. However, they can be categorized as two main types of cells due to some distinct differences. The first type of cell would be a prokaryotic cell, which has no nucleus, and that is the cell you see on the left. And the second type is eukaryotic, which does have a nucleus, which is the cell you see on the right. So the cell theory began with a man named Robert Hooke, who in 1665 decided to study the bark of cork trees under a microscope. When he did that with the microscope you see in the bottom right picture, he saw what you see in the bottom left picture. To him, he thought the objects looked like little rooms or little boxes, which reminded him of the rooms in the monastery in which he lived. And that's where the name cell came from. However, even though he was the first to discover cells existed, at this time, he did not really understand what their true function was. That came with a scientist by the name of Anton von Leeuwenhoek. He decided to expand on Robert Hooke's discovery of the cell, and he developed a microscope lens that could see a greater magnification, so he could see these cells in more detail. By doing so, he was the first person to observe bacteria and the first person to observe protozoa, which are single-celled animals. He was also the first person to observe and describe red blood cells, which we now know today are the cells that carry oxygen throughout our body. After Anton von Leeuwenhoek's discoveries, a scientist by the name of Matthias Schleiden, who was from Germany, decided to study plant cells. He concluded that all plant tissues are composed of cells and declared that the cell is the basic building block of all plant matter. During his studies, he kind of got this sense that the nucleus was very important. By studying all the different plant cells, he kept seeing the nucleus. He saw it was a very distinct structure, and so he knew it must have some kind of a value. He studied all of this in 1838, so as you can see, a few centuries after Robert Hooke's discovery and Anton von Leeuwenhoek's discoveries. To build on Matthias Schleiden's studies, Theodor Schwann decided to study animal tissue, and he concluded that all animal tissues are composed of cells too, just like the plant tissues. He collaborated with Schleiden and formed a new theory in biology, which then led to the development of the cell theory, and he did this in 1839, so only shortly after Matthias Schleiden. Through Schleiden and Schwann's ideas, we got the first two components of the cell theory we now know today. The first is that all organisms are composed of cells. They compared both plant and animal tissues, saw they were both made of cells, so they theorized that every living thing is going to be made up of at least one or more cells. They also concluded that cells are the basic unit of life. However, there was one thing that they still hadn't quite figured out yet, and that was where cells came from in the first place. This is where a man named Rudolf Virchow comes into play. Rudolf Virchow proposed that all cells result from the division of previously existing living cells. This idea became a key piece of the modern cell theory, and it was very different from previously existing ideas that people had about where life came from. One of those was spontaneous generation, which was that these living things would just come out of nowhere. Or like the study of bacteria and different diseases. Prior to the cell theory and prior to our understanding of cells and cell division, a lot of people thought that bacteria came from bad smells. That it was just strange odors that caused people to get sick. So by having a better understanding for what a cell is and where cells came from, we have a better understanding of life itself and different aspects of life, whether that be reproduction of living organisms or the spread of disease. So these 5 scientists and their studies led to our better understanding of cells, but the last 3, Schleiden, Schwann, and Virchow, really contributed to the cell theory that we know of today. The cell theory, the modern cell theory, is number 1, all organisms are composed of cells. Number 2, cells are the basic unit of life. And number 3, all cells come from the division of previous existing cells. And keep in mind on that third one, new cells have to come from currently living cells. So once a cell has died, it cannot reproduce new cells, similar to once a person has died, they cannot reproduce more offspring. Okay, so that leads us to the second essential question, which was understanding the functions of cells that all cells share. The first one is metabolism, which are chemical reactions inside the cell. You might have heard this word before when you're talking about perhaps losing weight or gaining weight, and you're learning about fast metabolisms and slow metabolisms. It's simply just the chemical reactions that are burning up the calories or the energy that you're consuming. The second function all cells share is response. All cells can perceive and respond to changes in their environment, which then leads to the third function, homeostasis, which is maintaining all the conditions, keeping things balanced as the external conditions change. So, for example, your cells can't control the temperature in your environment, but they can respond to that temperature change and maintain homeostasis by maintaining a steady body temperature to keep you living. If you're too hot, your body will react by sweating, so that sweat can evaporate from the skin and pull thermal energy from the skin and cool you down. If you're cold, then your cells might respond by sending more blood to your major organs to keep them alive, which is why typically your extremities are the first to get cold, or maybe you shiver to increase the blood flow to warm yourself up, or your teeth chatter, all examples of maintaining homeostasis, just in the realm of maintaining your body temperature. The other functions that cells share are growth. They all increase in size. You're clearly not the same size you were when you were younger. And even when you were born, you were a multi-celled organism. At one point in time, you were just a single cell. Reproduction. All cells reproduce. That's the third piece of the cell theory. Depending on the type of cell, some cells and organisms reproduce sexually, which requires a mate, and others reproduce asexually, which only requires one parent or one living organism. Another function they all share is nutrition. All cells need nutrition. They need to obtain food so that they can provide energy for growth for the living organism. And lastly, they all share the function of defense. They need to protect against enemies to keep the cell healthy and make sure that it survives so that the organism itself can survive. So, to make sure you understand this lesson, make sure you can answer these two. Number one, can you recognize that according to cell theory, all organisms are composed of cells? And number two, can you recognize that cells carry on similar functions, and do you know what those 7 functions are?